Obviously, we are now keenly aware of how we are affecting, as modern human, affecting the climate and the planet. So there are many activities organized at various levels to address climate change and to stay en route for global warming targets like 2 degrees centigrade by 2100 with 67% probability, net zero, decarbonization, and so on. So we'll just touch on a couple of those things. Coming back to the basic book we are using for this course, let's quote again Roots. So Jeffrey Sachs, you may have heard of, works a lot on poor countries, developing countries, international debt servicing problems, and so on and so forth. But Roots again here outlines 6 issues that must be addressed in the 21st century. The book picks Roots just because they are from that side of the community, but there are lots of such opinions, let's say, or educated views on how to do this. Let's go through these six that Roots outlines. The right to use some natural resources or amenity exercised by one individual or a group reduces the availability to someone else who in theory has equal rights. In the 21st century, people must acknowledge that there are no longer consumers but exchangers. So the first definition of sustainability, I think, was adopted in the Brundtland Conference in the 1970s, and it's very motherhood-like statement where it says sustainability means exploiting resources without affecting the ability of the future generations to exploit the same resources. Okay, but how to translate that into actual norms and punishments is not always obvious. But this is a broader point, saying that we cannot just see ourselves as just consuming, that we are actually exchanging ecosystem services, cultural ecosystem services, and so on with each other, or sharing them. Secondly, human population growth places 2 human rights in conflict: the individual and collective rights to natural resources and a healthy environment versus the right of humans as individuals to reproduce. Failure to voluntarily and collectively address this situation will likely result in severe human tragedy. Of course, this is from 1993, but by now it's obvious that educating girls and women has acted as a very good natural contraceptive, so fertility rates have dropped and actual populations have been turning down, negative replacement rate kind of reproduction rates in many countries in of course in Europe, but also China may reach its peak population by 2025, 2030 or something like this, and hopefully India will get there as well. So this population increase problem may not be as dire as one imagines right now. Of course we'll keep increasing because the initial population is still very high. What are the individual rights of a growing number of environmental refugees wherever they arrive, compared to the rights of people into whose region they come and whose resources they will want a part of? So this is an issue of climate change happening somewhere, driving climate emigration, climate refugees, environmental refugees, and often climate is not necessarily the proximal cause, as is always said, but can be an ultimate cause, a fight that breaks out because of persistent drought, crop yield losses, water stresses, and so on and so forth. So here it's a bit more complicated than it would appear here, because if drying of Sahel is caused by emissions, and emissions are mostly from the rich countries, then how do you help Sahel when its environmental refugees knock on your door? So these are kind of complicated issues. Thirdly, what are the individual rights of, okay, I already said that. What rights do people have to maintain their culture, their distinct societies, and their rights to be different when these rights have been, when these rights have been so impaired by the infringement of others? how are those rights guaranteed locally, nationally, and internationally? So I have a course called Drawdown and Bending the Curve, where we discuss social justice, climate justice issues. Climate action must be just and equitable, so that's part of this discussion as well. How do we identify and defend the rights of generations yet to come? So we are doing something now which is degrading the environment for a long time. So how does this affect future generations and their ability to live peacefully on the planet, including the global warming, sea level rise, etc. we're going to leave behind, and loss of glaciers, etc. So very complicated but important issue. What are the rights of humans compared to the rights of non-human species? This question highlights the importance of the human-nature conflict that was discussed above in Ursula Franklin's comment that humans function best the better they understand the workings of nature and the more they respect it. So all those are important issues. In terms of what humans have been doing, the awareness went up. Keeling curve, collecting CO2 from the 1950s. By 1970s, Wally Broker, and 1980s, Jim Hansen were already talking, and Ramanathan were talking about global warming and so on. So just in terms of timelines, first UN Environmental Conference in Stockholm, United Nations Environment Program, was formed as a result in 1972. In 1979, first World Climate Conference sponsored by UNEP, by UNEP, the WMO, the World Meteorological Organization, which still has a program called WCRP, World Climate Research Program, which manages the IPCC model simulations, scenarios, and so on. Establishment of the World Climate Program itself happened, that I just mentioned. In 1988, we had the establishment of the International Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, which has now become the big organization that coordinates assessment reports and the associated scenarios, simulations, and so on. 1990, UN General Assembly negotiations on a framework convention. So we had the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, by then. 1992, the text of United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is adopted, objective being to curb greenhouse gas emissions and to adapt to climate change. So the idea of managing the unavoidable and avoiding the unmanageable kind of thing, mitigation, adaptation. 1994, parties meet annually at the Conference of Parties to negotiate multilateral responses to climate change, COPs. Now we are up to COP 27, I think. UNFCCC enters into force. 196 countries signed the treaty in 1994. 1997, Kyoto Protocol adoption, the world's first greenhouse gas emissions reduction treaty, didn't quite succeed, and it's expired now and replaced by Paris Agreement. Nonetheless, in 2005, Kyoto Protocol entered into force. It was a top-down approach with many countries given exception, developing countries, on various fronts. 2009, Copenhagen Agreement, COP15. Negotiations failed after USA and China withdrew, which was a disaster, and obviously we continued on. Cancun Agreement happened in COP16 the following year. The Green Climate Fund, the technology mechanisms, and the Cancun Adaptation Framework are established there. 2011 COP17, governments commit to a new universal climate change agreement by 2015, which is the Paris Agreement. So 2015 COP21, adoption of the Paris Agreement by 196 parties to the UNFCCC. So whether these succeed or not, whether they are working well or not, whether the nationally determined contributions that came out of the Paris Agreement and are being revised will be met or not, one thing we have to agree that as a species, modern human is at the table. 196 countries agreeing on something is a remarkable testament to how we have evolved despite all the complexities of behaviors. Here we are, right? So in 2016, entry into force the Paris Agreement. Now we are still getting towards the monitoring, verification, reporting aspects of the submitted plans under the nationally determined contributions by each country, and the revision of those to meet the goals better. So what was the issues discussed at COP21 in Paris? Ambition, equity and differentiation, mitigation, transparency, acceleration on the pre-2020 climate action. Under adaptation, there was finance, capacity building, included forests, cooperative approaches and mechanisms, and response measures. Legal issues included loss and damage, which is a way of saying if a country gets hit by a climate hazard like a typhoon, can we figure out how much stronger it was because of climate change, and then assign some value to the additional loss and damage created by the strengthening of the natural process, natural event like a typhoon, and then compensate for the losses. Technology transfer, IP rights, and so on and so forth. So we have already talked about a little bit about the 2 degree C target also that came out of it, or evolved afterwards. As we said, 2 degree C is not a completely science-based target. It started with Bill Nordhaus in the 70s for an economic modeling, climate impact on economies, GDPs, and then it got picked up by the European Union, Stern report. Then IPCC said 2 degree C is too dangerous, so they wanted to head for 1.5. It's pretty clear that we'll cross 1.5 at some point, and so on and so forth. So 2 degrees C can be looked at in terms of a selected history of the 2 degrees limit. 1975, economist Bill Nordhaus expresses a first intuition that temperatures rising by more than 2 degrees C above pre-industrial levels would take the climate outside the range of observations, and there have been observations which have been made over the last several 100,000 years. Okay, 1988, NASA scientist James Hansen testifies to Congress linking greenhouse gas emissions to rising temperatures and the dangers associated with climate change. Almost a decade or longer before that, Wally Broker had already talked about the CO2 increase in the Keeling curve and the global warming that's already there, and he said we are poking the climate beast with a stick without knowing what the consequences will be. By 1990, Stockholm Environment Institute suggests 2 degrees above pre-industrial level should be the maximum warming policymakers allow. Rio Earth Conference in 1992 sees formation of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change we talked about, tasked with stabilizing greenhouse gas concentrations to prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. In 1996, the European Council of Environment Ministers, including John Gummer and Angela Merkel, declare global average temperature should not exceed 2 degrees above pre-industrial level. So it's much more of a political, social, economic statement at this point than a climate target. 193 countries signed the world's first agreement to cut emissions in Kyoto Protocol in 1997. US President George W. Bush abandons the first effort to ratify Kyoto Protocol in 2001. By 2008, US diplomats cut references to 2 degrees C from draft G18 summit conclusion. 2009 Copenhagen Climate Conference, world leaders failed to agree a deal to prevent temperatures rising more than 2 degrees C despite high expectations. China and US withdrew. Cancun agreement agreements commit governments to hold increase in global average temperatures below 2 degrees C. So let me leave this here and come back and discuss the future in terms of where we want to go, which is related to human response to climate change as well. So we are aware of a lot of things now in terms of our actions and their impacts on emissions, climate change, other species, functioning of the planet as a whole, and so on and so forth. So it's definitely worth looking at how we ourselves are responding to mitigate our own effects on climate and to adapt to the changes we've already put in place on track by the emissions we have created so far. Okay.